I think it is very important that they think about various human rights and not just the usual human rights that we talk about in the UK. So, for example, the right to environment. It's a really important right that maybe has not been talked about as much, or the right to cultural diversity, the right to one's culture, the right to work, the right to protest, etc. So what I would say to them is not focus on the rights that have been talked about and are being talked about every day in Western societies, and especially in the UK, but think more about other contexts and other human rights violations that are happening at the moment, so that we can have a more encompassing Charter of Human Rights. In international human rights law, we are usually talking about the three generations of human rights. The first generation of human rights are civil and political rights. So, this is the right to vote, the right to express one's opinions, free press, and free speech, etc. The second category of human rights that we should not forget is the social, economic, and cultural rights. So these are also very important rights, and they include the right to education, the right to work, the right to social security. And then we have the third generation of human rights that we started talking about quite recently, but they're also really important. So it's the heritage of the mankind, for example, is the right to food, the right to environment, the right to self-determination. So I think that it is very important not to focus on only one category of human rights, but to discuss and expand, all the categories of human rights that I just talked about. I think that's a very interesting question. In international human rights law, it is very important to understand that all human rights are really important. So, it is very dangerous to start to create a ladder where there are some human rights that are so and so, they're important but not that important, and then other human rights that are very important. And this is something that some states have tried to do and continue in the United Nations to do. So there are some states that continue to say civil and political rights are more important than economic and social rights. Why? If why is it more important to vote than to have to eat? Or there are some states that say the opposite. But do you want just to have to eat and not to have the freedom to vote and to determine on who's going to govern you? So in general, human rights do not have these distinctions. However, we do have a category of rights that we call non-derogable rights. These are the rights that even when there is a war, one should not restrict. So, for example, prohibition of torture. And that's very interesting in existing debates about the war on terror and everything else. Torture is not allowed even when there is a war, even when there is a national security issue, even when there is imminent danger. So torture is an absolute right. And in this respect, maybe one can see torture as prohibition of torture as a more important right. The same issue when it comes to the right to life. One may see that the right to life is definitely a very important right. And there are also some rights that we call rights, but also principles. So, for example, human dignity. Human dignity is an overall principle that should exist in every aspect of human activity. So, and should be respected in every aspect of human activity, and the state should respect it. So I would be very reluctant to accept that there is a ladder of human rights, but at the same time, I think we should be aware that there are some rights that should never be restricted. I think it is very important to remember that human rights came from liberal societies, and the idea was that the society, the people in the society, should feel free to do what they wish, unless there is a reason not to do so. So, for example, unless they violate other individuals' rights. So, this was part of liberalism and democracy. The problem is that we don't want human rights to become to exist only in Western democracies, and we don't want human rights to exist only in environments that are democratic, because if this is the case, then are we not going to talk about human rights in environments that don't value liberalism and democracy as much as Western societies? So I think that now there is very much a discussion, an ongoing discussion, moving away from understanding and accepting where human rights came from, but also moving away from liberalism and just talking about other rights that traditional liberalism was not very eager to talk about, such as collective rights, for example, rights of groups. Such as social and economic rights. Let's not forget that Western liberal democracies were very reluctant to talk about these rights during the Cold War in the 70s and 80s. So although the link is there and it's quite strong between human rights and liberalism, today we want human rights to go beyond liberalism. We want to talk about the human rights culture as such. I think this is a very interesting debate, and it is a very topical issue, especially because everybody these days is talking about a national security, and in view of the terrorist attacks that there have been in the world. Human rights are not absolute rights. So most human rights have are can be restricted. So, for example, apart from the prohibition of torture, that is absolute and cannot be restricted at any point for any reason, other human rights can be restricted. So if one's right to express their views goes against the non-discrimination prohibition. So if somebody wants to express views that incite to war or are deny truths that we all talk about, such as the Holocaust or other genocide and such events, then human rights, of course, can be restricted. But international human rights law says that at all times we should maintain a core of the human rights. So the absolute center of human rights should be maintained. And this is very interesting with respect to conflicts of laws. I talked about right to speech, but also, for example, women's rights and the right to culture. And this is something that a lot of us write about and talk about at the moment. But also the right to natural resources and the right to food vis-a-vis the economic development of the state. So there are a lot of, for example, Asian states that say that they need multinational corporations to go to their lands and create and develop projects. And on the other hand, we have the rights of the communities that live in these areas who say that their right to food is going to be violated and restricted. So an international lawyer, this is exactly what, what we do is we take all the various human rights that are being in conflict and we try to see at each situation which right should prevail or which principle should prevail. This is a very interesting debate, and again, it is a very topical issue, and it has been quite topical in the UK context as well. There have been some attempts, or shall I say, there are some attempts to link human rights to duties, but one should be very clear that human rights are there because human beings are there. So it doesn't really matter whether somebody is a criminal, or whether somebody disagrees with the state, somebody is not loyal to the state. These persons also have to have human rights. So you have human rights because you are a human being. So that's why we say that human rights are inherent to our nature as human beings. A lot of human rights. And this is so I don't think that it is very helpful to link human rights to duties, because then one ignores the idea of the inherent human rights. At the same time, there are some human rights that are specifically focused on citizens of a state. So, for example, the right to vote. I don't have a British passport. I cannot vote in the national elections, and that's fine. But so in this respect, my human rights have specific restrictions, but I wouldn't necessarily say that these restrictions are based to duties, and I would be very reluctant to link human rights to duties.